For those who are visiting, my name is Daniel Thomas. I'm one of the leaders here, and we are, as Michael mentioned, beginning a new preaching series, The Divine Attributes. That is to say, the attributes of God, the characteristics of God. There are various English phrases and terms that we might apply, but the divine attributes is what we shall be examining for essentially the better part of the rest of this year. To give you an outline, a broad general outline, knowing that man plans and God often laughs, here is what we shall be going through over the coming weeks and months. We will be examining these attributes in 20 parts, running us through ultimately to November the 20th. We will of course have a week there on October the 30th, which, as is our custom, our celebration of Reformation Day and Reformation Sunday specifically. And then we will continue that through for a couple more weeks to November 20th, leading us right into the beginning of Advent and the Christmas season and the 4 weeks of Advent leading into Christmas, in which we will be celebrating and caroling and doing all of our wonderful regular festivities, which we very much look forward to. There are, of course, when it comes to a subject like the attributes of God or the divine attributes, many ways in which these can be systematized and broken down. You will find lists that are perhaps 12 or 15 or 20 or much longer than 20, depending on how one wants to categorize and divide certain aspects. Even this particular subject which we are examining this morning, the word that you see above on the screen, a word which you may or may not be familiar with, and we'll explain it in a moment. A word, aseity. It itself could be divided into probably at least 2, perhaps even 3 categories. But nevertheless, our plan of attack will be to examine these attributes, studying the full counsel of God's scriptures, doing it in an expositional and exegetical fashion, yet moving through these subjects in a systematic and topical way. Does that make sense? Yep. What is the impetus for us going through such a subject? Of course, we're coming off of, in the recent past, our series on the Trinity and examining the substantive nature of the fact that God is co-equal and co-eternal, that he is 3 persons in one being, and all the various examinations of God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, which we did. But one such reason which I think can be held up as preeminent among the many reasons as to why one might examine such a subject as the attributes of God is, in essence, the following. Our endeavour, and indeed, as many would put it, the greatest endeavour in life, is in fact to know God. It is in fact to grow in the knowledge of God. It is in fact to know him more intimately and deeply, not merely on an intellectual or kind of rote, boring, cold intellectual level, but rather on a personal, intimate and relational one. So many of the great minds throughout the millennia of human history have pondered this very question. Who is God? Even such a question that seems so simple as to who is God is indeed so deep and profound in the very question that it is asking. We often do this. So many of you would have walked in here this morning and someone would have said to you, "How are you?" To which you would have responded in some variety or another, plus or minus, "I am fine, I am good, I am wet, I am," etc. And we engage in this kind of rhetoric all the time. But think for a moment substantively about the question that you're asking when you are giving and engaging in such small talk. How are you? Are. It's a verb. How are you? You are asking a question of nature, of substance, and ultimately of being. Of course, the response then coming, "I am fine, I am good." Am. I am what? Good. So seemingly simple on the surface level, especially in English, but is actually pointing towards something far deeper and far more profound. This is why an examination of the being of God, of who God is, who the supreme being is, a phrase we will examine in due course, This is why this is the apex of human thought. It is the highest peak and the greatest elevation that man's mind can possibly ascend to. And in fact, when speaking on this very subject, I believe off memory, it was January the 7th, 1855, in which the then 20-year-old, I think he was, Charles Spurgeon, was preaching a sermon on Micah chapter 3, verse 6, which is pertaining to a subject similar to this, namely the immutability of God, the unchangingness of God, a subject which we'll go through in a number of weeks' time. And here's what he said in his introduction. Let me just read this to you briefly. There is something exceedingly improving to the mind in a contemplation of the divinity. It is a subject so vast that all our thoughts are lost in its immensity, so deep that our pride is drowned in its infinity. Other subjects we can grapple with. In them we feel a kind of self-content and go about our way with the thought, behold, I am wise. But then we come to this master science, finding that our plumb line cannot sound or measure its depth, that our eagle eye cannot possibly see its height. And so we turn away. Yet with solemn exclamation, we indeed cry, I am but of yesterday and still know nothing. No subject of contemplation will tend more to humble the mind than thoughts of God. But while this subject humbles the mind, indeed it also expands it. Nothing will so enlarge the intellect, nothing so magnify the soul of man as a devout, earnest and continued investigation of the great subject of the deity. 20 years old. And in his masterful fashion, in his control of the English language, which is almost unmatched in the history of the church, thus Spurgeon pointed so rightly and so adequately to the magnanimity and the grandeur of this contemplation of the divinity, of the deity of God and who he is. And so what we're wanting to do this morning is move exegetically through a couple of passages, some in passing, some in more detail, right? Primarily revolving around Colossians chapter 1, which was read to us just briefly, specifically verses 16 and 17, and then also Acts chapter 17 and the account of Paul's incredible and historic speech at the Areopagus in Athens. Okay? Before we get there, though, let us actually define some terms. The word aseity. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to take a straw poll to see what I'm working with. Who has actually heard of that word, aseity? Brilliant. I love it when there's no hands because I get to paint with a blank canvas. Aseity, similar to the word deity, God. So one must think, well, okay, they must share a common root. Indeed they do. It's from the Latin. The word aseity simply means self-existence. Its root form, it means from self. Ase, from self, of oneself. So then when we think aseity of God, what on earth does that mean? What we are examining here this morning is what one would considerably argue is the cardinal attribute of God. It is the preeminent attribute of God. It is indeed the attribute that upholds all the other attributes. In one particular way, it kind of actually isn't an attribute. See, we'll examine many different things like the immutability of God, the omniscience of God, the omnipotence of God, the transcendence of God, the love, the grace, the mercy, the wrath, the justice, etc., etc., etc. And all these are indeed identifiable as attributes. Yet this concept of the aseity or the self-existence of God is not so much an attribute as it is indeed the very essence of who God is. It is the very essence of what defines him as deity, capital D, as divine, as God. It speaks to the very heart and the very substance of who he is. And indeed, it is the proverbial sun around which all the other attributes revolve. And so then we can see, hopefully, that this is quite an important subject for us to grasp. As difficult as it is, as impossible as it is, to proclaim and to exegete in merely one sermon. But nevertheless, this introductory fashion will indeed suffice. Why? Because by understanding this, we can then understand how all these other attributes of God relate to each other. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so when we consider the grandeur of the self-existence of God, what exactly are we talking about? Namely, we are talking about this: that God is completely autonomous and independent of anyone or anything. He has in and of himself everything that he would ever need. That is to say, he has no wants. There is nothing that one could point to and say, God needs that, or God desires or wants that. Why? Because he is self-existent. And fascinating, we actually get an introduction to this very concept in the first book of the Bible. And not only do we get it in the first book of the Bible, we get it on the first page. And not only on the first page, but indeed in the very first sentence. Barashit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God. Of course, then continuing that sentence, created the heavens and the earth. Something that's very familiar to us, something which every Christian knows from heart. But indeed, when you pause to actually consider the weight and the depth and the height and the gravity of what is being communicated, you will realize just how profound it is, and how indeed, on a literal or figurative sense, mind-blowing it in fact is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What is being communicated to us there? Notice that unlike the pagan religions of old, the gods did not come forth from the creation. This is something which we've examined before on a number of occasions, doing and engaging in comparative study, where we've seen how the gods, and in often cases the generations of gods, were begotten and brought forth from this primordial substance, often primordial chaos. But indeed here it says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What does that tell us? What does that automatically indicate to us? That when this beginning began, to use bad syntax, God was there. And when this beginning began, he created the heavens and the earth. The very structure and syntax of that sentence indicates and communicates to us that God existed before this beginning of the heavens and of the earth. When we start to contemplate what that means, we can often reach what we often refer to as the wall of our finite mortality. What was God doing before he created the universe, before he created time itself? Well, he was existing. Well, what did he do with his time? What time? Well, what I mean is, how did he fill his day? What day? It becomes weird to us in our mental capacity, in our finite mortality, to consider that God, to use the phrase of Moses in Psalm 90, is from everlasting to everlasting. For indeed that is what is attributed there in verse 2 of Psalm 90. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. There's that word are again. You are God. Almost like, how are you? It's a statement of being. And so then we see that God existed before the beginning and before the creation of the heavens and the earth. He existed in perfect unity, the one triune God, needing nothing, wanting nothing, being contingent upon nothing, being dependent upon nothing. He existed for eternity past, in and of himself, full, complete, and perfect. What implications does that have? Well, indeed, it has the kind of implications that drive the very purpose, just to reference that chapter of Genesis 1, as to why it is structured the way it is, why it was written the way it is. In a world in which the gods and humanity and all that you see came forth ultimately from the creation, from primordial chaos, from insert particular cosmology. Indeed, here we see a reversal. We see in Genesis 1 the truth, which is often the very inverse of what the ancient pagans so often taught. No, in fact, all of creation, everything you see and touch and hear and smell, has been brought forth from the one God, who in the beginning, a beginning that he began, created the heavens and the earth. This pre-existent God, self-existent, self-contained, having everything which he possibly needed. For indeed, he had no needs or wants. And what does this do for us? What does it mean that God is from everlasting to everlasting? There are so many different applications that could be drawn, could there not? There are many things which on a personal level one might attribute. How on earth can or should we sit here and be anxious, be fearful, succumb to anxiety and to worry and to strife and concern with all the happenings of life around us, things that are deeply personal, things that are external to us, and everything else in between? When you contemplate the reality that you are children and servants of the God who is from everlasting to everlasting. He existed before the creation of time itself. He is the very constant upon and around which everything revolves. He is the very arm that upholds everything you see and know, including yourself, including your life. That fundamental and rudimentary application alone should spring confidence, should spring faithfulness, should spring joy and wonder and awe. And this is exactly the reaction that has been had by so many Christians down throughout the millennia. So much of medieval theology is taken up with the absolute awe and wonder that was had through a deep and profound and thorough contemplation of this concept, the aseity or the self-existence of God. When we sit and ponder that our God exists beyond and apart from all things, he is not moved by anything, he is not swayed by anything, he is not shifted in ways that he does not quite desire. None of that. But instead, he is what Aristotle would refer to as the prime mover. He is the unmoved mover. He is the one who moves all things, who causes all things. Even so many of the great pagan, particularly Greek philosophers, this is the very subject that they chased after. And they got within the postcode, they got within the ballpark, while falling short. That indeed the divine, the deity, God, is this one who must be this first cause, this uncaused cause, the one who has caused and brought about all things, and simultaneously the one in whom all things have their being. Ironically, one might point out that perhaps the most ironic nomenclature that we use is that we are human beings. It's, of course, obviously a phrase which is perfectly acceptable. I'm not deriding the term per se. But we perhaps, in reference to the Supreme Being, might be better described as human becomings. Everything you have, everything you are, was indeed caused and brought about. Your very life was only possible because of the very generous genetic donation of your mother and your father. And the miraculous event which brings forth your life in the womb of your mother. The very fact that you grew up, that you survived, that you grew, that you were nurtured, that you developed, was not because you willed yourself to such power at the meagre age of 2, but indeed it was because you were raised and you were dependent upon others. We have all learnt from others. We have all gained skill from others. We have all been taught by others. Everything you hear this morning is unoriginal, and that is a good thing. There is nothing new under the sun. I have never had an original thought in my life. And if I am doing my job properly, then I am preaching to you the one true historic faith which has been preached over and over and over again down throughout the millennia. Right? The very fact that you sit here, the very fact that you awoke this morning, is because God indeed did so. The very fact that you arrived here safely, praise God, is because God brought it to be. As you sit there and become aware of your breathing and of the breath filling your lungs, of your lifeblood coursing through your veins, indeed that continues to happen because God sustains you, God upholds you, and God continues you forth. There is nothing in you or in anything else you see around you which is not upheld and persevered by the power of this self-existent God. So at this point we want to examine kind of why this is the case, and more specifically what kind of implications it has for us. Turn with me to Colossians chapter 1, which was read just earlier. This section of Colossians chapter 1 is incredible in its detail. It's talking about a lot of things. There is quite a considerable amount of what's called doxology occurring, praise and glorification, specifically of Christ. Colossians chapter 1 and 2 by extension, but especially Colossians chapter 1, contains such great depth about the person and character and work of the second person of the Trinity of Christ. Right? And the passage we're examining here, just verses 16 and 17, are in reference to him, so obviously by definition in reference to God. Okay? And so in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, we read the following. In reference to God, reading, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Wow. Very much aligned with what we've been exploring already. And this is incredible literature on the part of the Apostle Paul. In fact, there is actually some evidence, quite a decent amount of evidence, to suggest that these verses and other parts of Colossians here are actually paraphrases or perhaps even quotations of early hymns of the church that had already developed by this point. And so if you imagine that at least verse 15 to 20 essentially, those 5 verses, 15 through 20, were a hymn. That's some pretty incredible lyrics, are they not? To be singing about what is ultimately the preeminence of Christ. But let us examine what the Apostle Paul says here to us. So let's jump back to verse 16. Actually, I'll read from 15 just to give you some extra wording. He, Christ, God, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. We'll be covering that subject when we discuss the invisibility of God. That won't be for quite a while. Nevertheless, in verse 16, we continue reading. For by him, God, all things were created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And all these things, what are they? In heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Through him, for him. It's very reminiscent of a phrase that Paul uses elsewhere in Romans 11 in another doxology, which is a passage that we'll be referencing in other weeks, right, from Romans chapter 11, in which he says, for from him and through him and to him are all things. Right? It's the same kind of wording, right? From him, through him, and to him are all things. You see that cyclical image, right? From, through, to are all things. This is what it means for him to be self-existent. This is what it means for every single thing that exists, which is apart from the divine being. It has indeed been brought about by him. It is indeed made through him. It is indeed made for him and comes to him. Why? Because he is preeminent in all things. Because he is self-existent. He is above all things. He is beyond all things. A subject we will examine specifically when we look at the transcendence of God. You'll notice, just as a sidebar, that there will be a number of subjects going through systematically here which will have a fair amount of overlap. And that'll be good because it'll create consistency of thought and of the flow of what we're examining. Okay? But looking at this Colossians passage and seeing that all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, etc., all things were made through him and for him. For he is before all things. So now we're being told why. He is before all things. He is, to quote Psalm 90, from everlasting to everlasting, before any of the mountains were formed. For in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In him all things also hold together. That part's interesting. Because we can think quite intellectually and try to expand and extend our mind, as Spurgeon would refer to, when we contemplate that all things were made from him, through him, for him, and to him, right? But then we see here, the Apostle Paul finished this sentence by saying what? In him all things hold together. As the late American Reformed theologian R.C. Sproul would say, there is not a rogue molecule in the universe. There is not one atom that is out of place, that is not doing that which God has designed it to do. Everything. I want you to ponder And I want you to actually contemplate in your mind what it means for God to uphold all things. In him, all things hold together. How that relates to the world around you, how that relates to the very room you're sitting in, how that relates to your being, to who you are. All things, including you, your body, your mind, your soul. It is held together, it is upheld, indeed, by him. Every moment of every day, waking or sleeping, God upholds you. God sustains you. God makes you to endure. This is an incredible concept. It is a fascinating reality. It is something that, as I said, so many of the great minds throughout human history have strived for, have sought to mine the depths of, have endeavoured to climb the peaks of. That God, and in him, all things are held together, all things are brought about, all things are sustained and preserved. This reality was probably no better explained and encapsulated, certainly in the scriptures, arguably in the history of the world, than in Acts chapter 17, and particularly Paul's renowned speech in the Areopagus of Athens. Turn there with me, if you will, to Acts chapter 17. Whilst, of course, we have no particular letter to the church at Athens in the canon of the New Testament, indeed, this particular chapter, and certainly this portion of chapter 17 from verse 16 onward, is one of the most profound areas, not just of the book of Acts, not just of the New Testament, but indeed of the entire scriptures. It is one of the most important speeches / sermons, if you would like to call it that you find in all of the scriptures. Not just based on its content, but indeed based on its implications. Not just for the people who heard it, not just for the Athenians, not just for the Greeks, not just for the Romans, not just for the people of the first century, but indeed for all of mankind, and indeed for us also. And so Paul, to give you context in brevity, is here in Athens. He's come down from Thessaloniki, and here he is in Athens. Now, as we've mentioned plenty of times before, Athens, the philosophical and intellectual capital of the ancient world. It is ultimately the home and the working place of so many of the great Greek philosophers, of Socrates, of Plato, of Aristotle, Zeno, so on and so forth. So much came forth from Athens. Athens' impact and effect upon the world has endured even to this day. And so naturally, when ancient tourists hopped off the bus, so to speak, upon arriving in Athens, the common sentiment and feeling one would have to imagine would be awe, inspiration, grandeur, wonder, amazement, especially in this time, whilst not being the heyday of classical Greece from the 5th century BC, nevertheless, the full scope of the Acropolis, right, and of the Parthenon particularly, that resides high and lifted up above the city of Athens, in its, what to us now is former glory, would have been an incredible sight to see. It would have been so profound, and one would have so easily pointed toward it as the greatest and highest achievement of man. But what's interesting to note here is in verse 16, and as to what Paul's actual reaction was upon arriving in Athens. In verse 16 we read, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols." Paul's a very educated man. As we've explained before, a Jew ethnically, a Greek culturally and educationally, and a Roman citizen. Okay? Highly educated, a very smart man, highly intellectual. He would have been familiar with every sentiment of philosophy present in Athens in that day and before. And his first reaction is not the wonder and amazement which would have been so commonplace in this day, and even to one extent, certainly to this day itself. No, his reaction was sadness, essentially. His spirit was provoked within him. He was saddened to see the idolatry in the city. Why? Because of the grave insult that idolatry is in the face of a God who exists above and beyond and before all things. And the incredible insult it is to then take that which he has created, that he created, not you, and lift it up into the same level and status as the creator himself. That is why his spirit was provoked or saddened. But then he delivers what is simply one of the most incredible polemics, arguably, in the history of the world. And so let's look at verse 22 and read. "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus," now it's important to define what that is before we continue. The Areopagus was a smaller hill in Athens, just offset from the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is, the high mountain of Athens. And what would occur there? Well, various things. Primarily, the judicial court of Athens would meet there. Often the early forms of polis or democracy would meet there, right? And decisions in democratic fashions would be made. But also, especially at this particular time, it was the seminal ground, it was the primary area of Athens in which philosophers and intellectuals would give speeches and have discussions and debates and so on. Okay? A very important place, easily the second most important place other than the Acropolis and the Parthenon atop it. Okay? And so here he is going to the very heart where so many of the great minds of the ancient world had once stood. And so as he's standing in the midst of the Areopagus, Paul says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, quote, 'To the unknown God.'" It's estimated that certainly at this particular point in the first century, there would have been somewhere in the ballpark of about 30-ish thousand idols, probably, roughly speaking, atop the Acropolis and the sprawling areas like the Areopagus and the Agora, or the marketplace, right? And those kinds of areas, right? Tens of thousands of idols, covering all the different needs that any such man could ever hope to have or find. A God that would help you in any particular fashion you may so need. And indeed, just to cover their bases, one would suppose, they had an inscription "To the unknown God," just in case they had missed anyone, so as to not offend any deity and incur their wrath, as was often the worry of the ancient Greeks. And so what Paul does, in a very clever fashion, is he zeroes in on this concept of the unknown God, the God who is unknown to you, Athenians, to you, O great and wise ancient men. And in doing so, here's what he says. "What therefore you worship as unknown, this I now proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and of earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. This is a classical proclamation of the Aseity of God. He does not reside in your lavish, extravagant and awe-inspiring temples. He is not being served by your small, contemptible human hands. No, indeed, he's the very one who gave you hands. He is the very one who sets your hands in motion. If he so desired, your hands would stop moving right now. In him is everything. Why? Because it's not as if he needed anything, right? He is not contingent upon anything. He has no need of anything. He is completely self-existent, self-sustaining of himself. And so in verse 26 we continue to read, and he made this one God who is self-existent, who is before all things. In verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live upon the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Of course, the ancient Greeks were, to put it politely, no stranger to warfare. They had a strong warrior culture, especially encapsulated in no greater fashion than that of Sparta, right? And the Spartans, which have become quite renowned in the modern day. They were no stranger to borders shifting, to conquest occurring. Of course, in this particular time, they are 300 years after the great conquests of Alexander the Great, who went forth and conquered the archenemy of Greece, namely that of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persians, and built the largest empire the world had ever seen, the most powerful, the most influential. They were no stranger to this concept of borders changing and of the movements of humanity. And here Paul is saying that God is the one who is sovereign and in control over all of those things. It only occurs because he brings it to be. For in all things are through and for him. And he says, yet he is actually not far from us, from each one of us specifically. Saying in verse 28, and this is the real punchline of what we're examining here. It's the first half of verse 28. For in him we live and move and have our being. Now what's fascinating here is that Paul is actually quoting a Greek philosopher, or a Greek philosopher poet, Epimenides of Crete, who existed, roughly speaking, about 600 BC, plus or minus. And this actual line from one of his poems, Kritika, is actually in reference to Zeus. Here, the Apostle Paul is taking that which is familiar to them, Christianizing it, recontextualizing it, and applying it in its factuality, in its truthful way, unto the one true God. Fascinating. He's quoting Greek philosophers here, saying that of God, in him, what? We live and move and have our being. We live in him, through him, by him, for him. We live. Our very life, the breath in our lungs, the blood coursing through our veins, is of and by and through him. In him we move. And that's not just simply saying it in a kind of ethereal, poetic fashion. No, he means this when he says this. Our very movements are because this pre-existent and self-existing God moves all that we see. As we referenced earlier, he is the unmoved mover. He is the uncaused causer. He is the one that brings about all things. You're moving, you're going and froing and toing and every other word we could throw in there is because of him. And it is a gift from him. Interestingly to note, the very concept of movement and the need for something to be moving us is not something that applies to him. Obviously, this is somewhat on the nose for someone at my age to say, but to put it in a very polite and diplomatic fashion, as we enter our golden years of life, we often find that our bodies do not move the exact same way as they once did in yonder. A sentiment which I understand, not from an experiential perspective, but at least intellectually, is a reality. We find that the knees don't sometimes work, that the feet need to be warmed up, that the hair gets a little bit greyer and greyer seemingly every day. And praise God for old age, praise God for not the twilight and the lower ends of life, but what should be the golden years, so to speak. Praise God for all that. But what we find when we grow older is that this very concept of movement can often become harder. Because our bodies change, our bodies are corruptible, our bodies decay. Such change and decay, not a problem for God. It's not something that exists in him. It is not something that is endemic to his experience. He is unchanging. That's a characteristic or an attribute we'll be looking at. The immutability, it's called, the unchangingness of God. Because he exists in and of himself. But indeed we are told that our movement is also in him. But then how does Paul finish this quotation? In him we live, in him we move, and in him we have our being. Our very existential reality. The very fact that we exist is because of him. The very fact that the world around you exists is because of him. And to give you what is really an important point here, it becomes very easy, speaking of application, to, in the face of the kind of, troughs and waves of atheism and of secularism and of naturalism and the various other different descriptors which are kind of all describing the same thing. So often, at least in the last 50 to 100 years, too often I should say, the church has allowed itself to be, I suppose, intellectually bullied into thinking that our doctrine, to thinking that the realities of what the scriptures proclaim forth are somehow ridiculous ideas, that they are somehow foolish and laughable notions that are worthy only of scorn. The reality of that occurrence is that unfortunately it's actually the other way around. Okay. The very proof, the very evidence that one could ever hope to claim forth as to the existence of God is standing right before you. And no, I'm not referring to myself as if I was some great magnanimous being. The very fact that I stand here proclaiming forth utterance by way of my tongue and my mouth is the very proof of the Creator himself. For indeed the creation testifies to the Creator. And not just in a nice spiritual kind of way. No, actually in a completely logically, reasonably, rationally necessary way. Does that make sense? Yeah. This was one of the greatest expositions of some of the medieval theologians. That God is by definition necessary for the creation to exist. That might seem like a really simple and kind of obvious statement. Think with me deeply here for one moment. If a self-existing God has no need for anything else, he has no need to create anything, he has no need for something that by way of creating it he would now have and it's all good now, right? If that be the case, and indeed it is, logically, scripturally, then what we can infer from that is the following. The creation, the material, the everything that you see, in fact denotes that creator exists. There's not a person in the world who looks at this little pocket computer, more powerful than that which powered the Apollo 11 space mission, and goes, wow, it's incredible how that was brought about by naturalistic evolutionary means. No one. A 5-year-old knows that a phone was made. Anyone who looks at what is ultimately reasonably simple applications of woodwork that reside all around you here, in the pews and the pulpit and so on, a 5-year-old knows that a woodworker made this, that someone who specialises in timber was cut, and then that was transported, and then that was made by artisans. But yet when we expand out to the level of nothing less than everything that exists, the entirety of the universe, you have those who in their blindness and in their abject and embarrassing foolishness legitimately attempt to claim that nothing created everything. That in the beginning, nothing exploded, and when that nothing exploded, it brought about everything that you see. And nothing caused that nothing to explode. The nothingness just simply exploded, and ta-da, here we are. From the goo to the zoo to you. Really? That is what gets lifted up in our society as supposedly the height of human reason and logic and rationality? That nothing brought about everything, and that nothing caused that to happen. If anything, we should stop being so intimidated by claims that when you actually just examine them logically and reasonably and rationally, prove themselves to be literal nonsense. Do you understand? Yeah? You are not foolish for believing this. This is not just blind faith which you hold. We're never called to have blind faith. This is not just merely the tradition that you've inherited, and it's a nice moral code, and it's a nice little cultural thing that we've kind of inherited down through Western civilization. No, this is the only thing, by logical implication, that denotes or is necessary for explaining the reality of all that you see. It's the only thing. And it's those who deviate from that who are then wandering off into foolishness, into literal nonsense. How incredible then, to finish on this point, is it for us to contemplate that we worship and serve and are indeed children of and have been made children of this one divine God who existed from everlasting, literally from time immemorial, and who continues to exist and who will forevermore exist. and that in him, through, by, because, for, as a result of him, we live, we move, and we have our very being. This is why Spurgeon's words that I read at the beginning are so true. As to the incredible height and depth and breadth that the contemplation of the divine brings. And moreover, that there is nothing that humbles the human mind and heart more than a true and thorough contemplation of the self-existing God, the one who is before all things and through whom all things live, move, and have their being. It's important as we examine all these attributes of God, the divine attributes, that at a foundational level we examine them and contemplate them and meditate upon them and ponder them through the lens of and upon the foundation of the Aseity of God, the self-existence of God. Amen.